Welcome to the Classical Gabfest, a weekly discussion about the ever-changing world of classical music. I'm your host for this week, Kensho Watanabe, and with me as always are Tiffany Liu and William White. This week, in honor of St. Patrick's Day, we'll start off with an introduction to some little-known Irish orchestral music. Then we'll take a look at the curious selections on Brides.com's 65 Best Classical Wedding Songs list. And finally, we'll speak to music education researcher Martin Bergee about a recent study he published. But first, we like to start with our prelude segment. So, Will, what do we have today?
This week, we'll be playing a round of everyone's favorite game, Listening Limbo. In this game, I will name a category of works, say for example, Beethoven symphonies, and our contestants will wager the amount of listening time they think it would take them to identify a piece in that category. After the wagers are in, they'll each hear the clip for the amount of time that they've specified, and the contestant with the correct answer in the shorter amount of time wins the round. All right, guys, here we go. Your first round today is Requiems. Requiems. How do you feel about Requiems?
Roughly the same way I felt about, what was it? You did one category that was like a few listening limbos ago, like choral symphonies. I feel exactly the same as I felt about that category.
No, that was Kensho did that.
Oh, was it? Okay, well, anyway, I had to play that round, and it was like, okay, well, I don't know anything about them, but I know, what I know about one work, I'm probably certain to get all of within the first few seconds and not be able to gain any more from an extended period of time.
This is a big hole in my repertoire. I mean, I'm obviously familiar with the well-known works, but I also don't think I've ever conducted or even played a requiem, not even Mozart.
Oh my. So
it's only through the years of a listener that I am diving into this. So not a lot of confidence here.
There's the big, I don't even know, is it like a big three? In my book, it's a big three: Mozart, Verdi, and Brahms, I guess, if you call that, Ein Deutscher Requiem, which is kind of oddball in the grand scheme of things. And I can tell the difference between those three.
All right, well, our coin has been flipped, and Kensho, you are the first to bid today. How are you going to bid on Requiems?
See, if I were playing Will, I could comfortably say like 15 seconds, knowing that I'll win. But here, Tiffany, the savant here, I have to go aggressive.
Well, as was proven to us this past week, we've had a great listener tally up our wins, and I'm actually last place right now in terms of game wins. So don't oversell me.
6 seconds.
Bold move. Tiffany, how do you like to counter?
Sure, I'll go 5 seconds.
5 seconds. Okay. All right. So Kensho has the longer bid, which means that he is the first to play. So Tiffany, we will reconvene with you in just a few seconds here. Kensho, are you ready?
No, but bring it on.
All right. Here is your 6 seconds of a requiem.
Oh, jeez. Did I hear a piano? I heard a piano. Some strings, and a chorus. Man, it does not sound like Verdi, nor does it sound like Brahms. The only other requiem outside of the three that we just discussed is Fauré, but I don't think it's Fauré either. I don't know. I'm shooting blindly now. Well, I'm just gonna shoot the Fauré shot and see what happens.
Kensho, you are correct.
Yes! I am so lucky. That was such a lucky guess.
All right, Tiffany is rejoining us here. Tiffany, the pressure is on. Kensho correctly identified the composer of this requiem.
Oh, good.
So now it is your turn. Are you ready for your 5 seconds of requiem?
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's Verdi, isn't it?
Is that your final answer?
Yeah, I think it's Verdi. Final answer.
Ooh, Tiffany, so sorry.
No?
Incorrect. This was the Requiem of Gabriel Fauré.
Oh, which I don't know.
Kensho, I don't think that you did hear piano. I think you heard pizzicato.
Pizzicato, yeah.
Is there a harp in there? I know that there's a harp in that one.
There is, yeah. There
and
is
no
harp in there.
strings or something. It's no violins or something. It's some weird instrumentation for 4A. Isn't
It exists in different versions.
Okay.
But yeah, you're right. There is a version with no violins. All right, guys. Well, hopefully our second category will play a bit more to your strengths, to our two violin superstars here on the GabFest. The next category is Paganini Caprices.
Oh, no.
I literally skipped through this whole body of repertoire because of how insufferable they are to play.
I've never, ever learned them by number. I know I know what 1 sounds like. I know what 24 sounds like. I think I know what 17 sounds like, but it's mostly just like keys and also what physical pain I went through to learn.
Exactly.
Caprice,
We know them by technique.
Wait, have you guys played all of these?
No, I haven't played all.
No, I think I've played like 4 of them. Here's the thing about the Paganini Caprices, right? Like, you learn them for auditions, and then you drop them like the hot potato they are.
And there's also a reason that we became conductors.
Right.
Right. I mean, so this is a question I have for the two of you is like, as I know that they're painful to play. Like I don't know that from personal experience, but I know like from, your reactions that they're painful to play. Do you find them satisfying listening?
This is what I was going to say is that, yes, we can joke about it being enduring physical pain to play this piece. But I think more importantly is the hard part is actually not the technical stuff. It's actually making it sound like music. So when the person has such technical skill that everything is easy and they can focus on just being musical with it, then yes, it's actually kind of fun to listen to. But when you're hearing the struggle, then it's obviously not fun. So,
and I would say that describes even most professional recordings of these pieces.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like, even the best violinists in the world, all I hear is how fast the things are or how clean and easy it sounds for them, which is like, okay, great, good for you. I'm not bitter. No, but the Paganini is like way at the bottom of my bucket list in terms of things I would like to actually play on the violin.
Okay, so Tiffany, you're the first to bid in this round. How do you like to bid? You got 24 choices here. How long would it take you to identify one of them?
Similarly, if I know it, I'm going to know it. And if I don't, I'm not going to know it. So I'll go 5 seconds again.
Oh, boy. All right.
The thing about things like this is that they're largely the same technique like throughout.
Right, there's like a
there might be a
motif.
middle section or one shift in the middle somewhere where it goes to a different technique. But when you hear a bar, that's pretty much what you're going to get for the Caprice.
So, Kensho, Tiffany's in with 5 seconds. How do you like to bid?
I'm playing with the lead. I'm going 4 seconds.
Oh, boy. All right. So, Kensho is going to depart from us. Tiffany is going to be the first to hear 5 seconds of a Paganini Caprice. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Here we go.
See, I can sing this one the whole way through. I don't know what number it is. It starts with a slow section. It goes, and then this is the second section. This is the beginning of the second section, which is faster, obviously, and kind of bounces around and does the octaves all the way up on the upper low strings for a while. And then I can't remember. Does the slow section come back? I can't remember. But I can sing it the whole way through. I do not know what number it is. So, with that, I know which numbers it's not.
Well, that'll get you someplace.
Wait, I think 14?
Very close. Off by 1, unfortunately. This is number 13 in B flat.
All right.
All right. Kensho, Tiffany came very close.
Swing and a miss, in essence, is what he's saying.
But she was actually only 1 off from the
Which
number
means
here.
nothing in this context.
But she was able to identify the piece, by listening.
Okay,
All right, Kensho, are you ready for your 4 seconds of a Paganini Caprice?
bring it. Yes, this is one that has 2 sections. I think it's in the teens. This is one that I've played too. I'm going to go 16.
Well, sorry to say, Mr. Watanabe, you're incorrect. This is number 13 in B flat.
16 is the 16th note one, which is like, is it?
Oh, yeah, sure. Why not?
Why not?
Let's move on.
Right?
All right, guys, your final round today is Brandenburg Concerti,
Oh,
music of Bach. How do you guys feel about Brandenburg Concerti?
pretty good.
I mean, the thing about Brandenburg Concerti is that each of them has a really different instrumentation. One of them is for just strings, one of them has a big old harpsichord solo, one of them has just the big trumpet solo. And so assuming that those instrumental markers are used in whatever excerpt that Will chooses, this should theoretically be something that's identifiable in not too long of a time.
One thing that also makes this a slightly easier round is that there's only 6 Brandenburg Concerti. Of course, there's probably 20 movements, and of course we do want the movement if we can get it from you.
Mm-hmm.
So, Kensho, you are the first to bid on this round. How do you like to bid?
The strategy, I think, is to bid aggressively here. I'm going to go 3 seconds.
Kensho in with a very strong bid of 3 seconds. Tiffany, how do you like to counter?
Do I want 2 seconds? Yeah, sure. Why not?
Very nice. Okay, this is what we like on Listening Limbo. All right, so Kensho has the longer bid. He's going to listen first. Tiffany has logged off. Kensho, are you ready for your 3 seconds of a Brandenburg Concerto?
I really hope I don't regret this. Here we go. Okay, it's the last movement. There's one that's all strings, which is number 3. Okay, the 6th one is definitely not number 6. I'm just going to process of elimination here. It's not 3. It's not 6. It's not 1 or 2, I don't think. And also the use of the flute. So I'm down to like 4 or 5. That's the question. My gut says 4, so I'm going to say the last movement of number 4.
Kensho, I'm afraid you're incorrect.
No! Is it 5?
As a matter of fact, it is.
Oh, no! Oh, okay, but Tiffany only has 2 seconds. There's some hope. All
right, Tiffany. Kensho
Oh, I blew it.
Blew it.
I blew it.
He was very close.
How are you counting close? Like either you're on it or you're not.
He narrowed it down to 2.
Yeah, and then I picked the wrong one.
And then he chose the incorrect one.
Oh,
dang.
Well, that doesn't actually bode that well for me because probably we know the same ones. But okay, let's do it.
Are you ready for your 2 seconds here?
Mm-hmm.
Here we go.
Well, it's not 3 or 5, I don't think, which don't have a flauto traverso or recorder or whatever that was in it. Nor is it 6 because that one doesn't have any winds in it, as far as I remember. Those are just lower strings. That's a strange one. It's not number 2 because that has a trumpet in it. So that leaves, what have I left? 1 and 4? Okay, and that was what I will suppose is D major. Let's go 4. I know 4 has actual solo recorders because that's the shape of. I think there's multiple ones actually. I think it's 2, and I think 1. I can't remember how many 1 has, but has a number of other wind instruments. And I guess it doesn't sound like a first movement to me, so maybe I'll go movement 3. Although I can't even remember how many movements are in number 4. So let's go with that.
Final answer?
Mm-hmm.
Tiffany, I'm afraid that you made the same mistake as our good friend Kensho here. This is actually number 5.
So 5.
Yeah.
Which I don't know the last movement of because no one gets there in middle school orchestra. So
yes, I also played this in middle school orchestra.
Mm-hmm.
This was an interesting round of Listening Limbo. Kensho is the winner with 1 point, which he got for identifying the Fauré Requiem. That is not an outcome that I would have ever anticipated. Kensho, congratulations. That was a great round of Listening Limbo. Thank you guys for playing.
I don't know if I would call it that, but okay.
Doesn't feel like a win either, yeah, but let's move on.
That just about does it for this week's Prelude segment, but before we wrap up, we'd like to mention a special opportunity for our listeners. If you mention your love for the GabFest on social media or in an email to your classically inclined friends, tag or CC us, and you'll be entered for a chance to come on the show and participate in one of our Prelude games, and I promise you it won't be as dastardly as this one. It's a win-win. You get the fun of a musical listening challenge, and more people get to enjoy our wonderful show. And with that, we move on to our first topic. So, Tiffany, what do you have for us?
Well, listeners, as you know, we here on the GabFest often enjoy coordinating our segments on the podcast to holidays that are in the vicinity of our release date. So we really wanted to devote a segment to classical music from Ireland in anticipation of St. Patrick's Day on the 17th of March. But then we realized that none of us actually knew any Irish classical music. So in our first segment, I am going to introduce the boys to some music by the Irish composer Charles Villiers Stanford. To start off with, do either of you know anything about Stanford?
I do, because there are a few choral pieces that are beloved. The most famous being Beati Coram Via, which is a motet for 6 voices, which I could just bathe in for the rest of my life. It is so gorgeous. It's so satisfying to sing. That's about as much as I know of Stanford.
Kensho?
Nope.
That was exactly my reaction, right? And like, how depressing is it that like when we said, let's do Irish music, I drew a 100% complete blank, with the small asterisk exception of Victor Herbert, who was an Irish American.
Yeah, Victor Herbert's like, he's an Irish person, but like a Viennese composer.
Right.
You know?
Well, and that I think accounts for some of the obscurity of Irish composition, because it seems in many ways to get subsumed into the larger English, or we'll say European school. And Charles Villiers Stanford is no real exception. He falls solidly in the Romantic canon with style and instrumentation and compositional tools. But I've really enjoyed my recent dive into his Irish Rhapsodies. So he wrote 6 of these, and they're fun because they span the entirety of his career. Number 1 falling somewhere, it was one of his earliest successes. So Stanford's dates are 1852 to 1924. And actually, that puts him solidly in the late Romantic era, and one person that he often gets compared to is Brahms. So his Irish Rhapsodies, I've really, really enjoyed my dive into them because they span basically the gamut of his career. One of his early successes, in fact, it eclipsed all of his later Irish Rhapsodies to a point where he was like kind of eye-rolly about it towards the end of his career. He really was a little salty about the fact that everyone kept on going back to the first one.
That reminds me of another composer of ethnic rhapsodies, George Enescu.
Oh, yes.
Who wrote that first Romanian Rhapsody, and that followed him around, when he was 18 years old, and that followed him around for the rest of his life.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess that's worth mentioning too, just to contextualize this oeuvre, is that, you've got the Romanian Rhapsodies of Enescu, and then there are, of course, the Hungarian Rhapsodies of Liszt. So it seems like the Rhapsody form, what is a rhapsody? I mean, I would be curious to know if either of you have an answer to that question. It's a pretty amorphous form.
Well, it suggests like improvisation, right? So
Right, yeah. And I mean, so there's no specific instrumentation, I guess, that it has to conform to. I mean, it could be a piano piece, it could be an orchestral piece just as easily.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And I was going to ask you guys what you thought of the genre of rhapsodies. So thanks for wrapping us into that already. What I discovered on listening to these is that not just is Rhapsody, like we have the kind of improvisational, like metric freedom kind of aspect to it, but a lot of these are really based on tunes that are known outside of this context, right? Like there are original melodies inside these rhapsodies, but they're like musical references. Like we study musical references most often, I think, in the context of like let's say even classical symphonies. Like there are references to common dances or common beats or common tunes, a la chorales and these kinds of things. There are overt references to things that exist in the cultural, what's my favorite word again? Milieu of the time. And this is no exception. And I think a lot of those folk rhapsodies often fall into these categories as well. Yeah. Okay, so if I say to you, what are the Irish tunes that you might think of to base a rhapsody upon? What's going to be like at the top of your list?
Oh, Danny boy, the pipes are calling.
Which, as far as folk tunes go, is actually so good. One gripe that I often have about just folk strophic things that often get to be incorporated in classical music is like they're often really, the phrase structure is really straightforward and the melodies themselves are a little bit repetitive. So just the fact that the second half of that phrase starts da 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 dum instead of ba da da da, right? That's the beginning. And then the second half starts da 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 dum. And then of course you have the da 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 ya da 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 dum. I mean, it's just like the ideally shaped arch melody that doesn't bore me. So I like this tune a lot, and I think it accounts for a large part of why this Rhapsody gets performed more than any other one, all 6 of them. Okay, so I'll play the opening. The opening is very mysterious, it's very kind of coming out of the mist, and then the cellos come in with the melody, and it is glorious. So reference number 1 is obviously this sort of, almost like a jig reference to this like the folk dance aspect to it. And it goes on like this for a long time. And then we have what I'm going to call the money moment at about 5 minutes in. We have a little bit of like Brooks Scottish fantasy in there with the harp stuff. We have a little bit of Dvorak in there at the end, the string harmony, and just the fact that he sets the whole tune, but with all these phrase extensions that sound perfectly, not like natural the way that you would sing it, or superficial as painted onto what everyone knows of the folk tune. Because a lot of people knowing this could sing the entire thing, but there's just enough variety in there to be like, he's actually taking that tune into his own hands and doing something. And he continues to do this. He continues to do this for a lot. But I mean, it's just a very sweet moment in there. And you
said that he compared a lot to Brahms, but I mean, this screamed of Tchaikovsky. It screamed of Tchaikovsky. Like the clarinet and like the clarinet and bassoon writing at the low clarinet and bassoon writing, and then the harp, and then of course like setting the first stanza of the song in the cellos, and then using English horn instead of something else. I don't know. It was like all the tricks of like Tchaikovsky's ballet music was in there.
That's interesting. Like that's all of what you said to me speaks of Dvorak. Like take Marsh Slav or something, for instance, where he sets the tune and he doesn't mess with the phrase lengths. I mean, if there's one thing that I know about Tchaikovsky is that I can regularly count to 4 and 8 in his melodies. And the fact that I can't do that to this is what I find, one of the most rewarding things about listening to it.
True.
But all the instrumentation things are, you're right. It's all Tchaikovsky, Dvorak, all these like big romantic tricks. Yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely a freedom that I admire to the writing here in terms of his treatment of the main theme. The opening here reminded me more of like Ray Vaughan Williams, but with a little less mysticism. And then the beautiful melody in the cellos. It has some of that like what I call like river raft harmonies and kind of a structure and orchestrations. Very beautiful. It just makes you think of like flowing down a river. Another thing that I was thinking while listening to this, and this makes me feel awful. It's just like the rank conductor brain inside of me. When you think about a Rhapsody, one thing about Rhapsodies is that they tend to be very sectional.
That's true.
They can be a bit of a medley. And so I was thinking to myself, gosh, if you were like trying to program an orchestral piece on like a St. Patrick's pops and you have the chieftains coming in and you just need that, orchestral solo piece, you could just do the Danny Boy section of this and it'd be awesome.
Well, so all of what you said, Will, makes me feel as if I haven't quite given you any idea of the complexity of the composer quite yet. So let me play a little section towards the end of this where you hear that there's what I think is quite a successful melding of Danny Boy with a number of other themes that come along, and some of which might read a little academic to you. I mean, in the way that we've mentioned, fugal sections as sort of, oh, here's where I show off as a composer kind of style. But he does have that in this piece, actually. There are sections here where I feel like, okay, we're going into, what might be considered solidly European school composition in a good way, actually. I mean, I say that in a stodgy kind of tongue-in-cheek fashion, but I think that the end of this is quite impressive. But I have a question for you guys. Do you think that he would have been more well-known now if his name weren't Stanford?
Right.
Does a name speak of where you're from? And what's in a name anyway, But I don't know. I have a theory that I'm sort of nursing here, which is that if this guy's name had been Mulligan or something like this, then I might have come across him at some point. Okay, that just about wraps up this segment. Let's go to Kensho for segment number 2.
Back in November, in celebration of my wedding, we at the Gabfest dedicated the segment to the Holy Trinity of wedding music, leading up to the great reveal of my wedding ceremony playlist. Clearly, in response to our segment, and not to be outdone by a mere 3 works from the classical repertoire, in December, Brides.com released its list of 65 best classical wedding songs for a timeless ceremony. Of course, the list includes our Holy Trinity of Pachelbel's Canon, Wagner's Bridal Chorus, and Mendelssohn's Wedding March from A Midsummer Night's Dream, but it also has some surprising selections, not the least of which is the Dies Irae from Verdi's Requiem.
Oh my god.
Yes, you heard that right. So, I mean, before we start having fun with this, 65 songs? I mean, who's looking at this and saying, because I'm assuming that the people that go to brides.com and are looking for classical music, like, oh, I want classical music. Do they need 65 options? Is that helpful?
I would think that would be so overwhelming.
Yeah.
Especially when there's no clips or anything, in this list. There's no
that's the real problem,
YouTube
right?
links or whatever. There's just underneath every one of them, there's a little note, why we love it.
Can I read a few of these? This is so great.
Please do.
Okay, so I picked 2 of my favorites. Okay, so the first one is the first movement of Mozart's Symphony number 40 in G minor. And the tag, why we love it, is bring on the suspense with a Mozart piece that will leave guests scrambling to snag the bouquet. What?
Yeah, right. And that brings up a point too, which is that you would expect this list to just be the bridal entry or, the wedding party coming down the aisle or maybe the flower girls or something.
Bouquet catching music. That's what's been missing.
Right. Yeah. This list seeks to be the complete musical wallpaper of the entire day of the wedding, basically.
Yeah, just imagine a scenario where the bride's about to toss the bouquet and you hear this. The other one that I really love is This is from the Verdi Requiem. Why we love it. An epic wedding song to include in your processional or bouquet toss. Again, what is with the bouquet toss music? Are we so concerned about bouquet toss music? Is there such thing as bouquet toss music?
Who out there has played music for the bouquet
Please,
toss?
like anybody that's played a lot of wedding gigs, I want to know if somebody's ever requested bouquet tossing music, and what does that entail?
Maybe, but look, maybe this brings up a good point that that weddings and the wedding parties are under musicalized, and that we need more of an underscore for all of the various elements of a wedding party.
I'm just imagining like all those bass drum hits and people like scrambling for their bouquet. It's like boom, boom. Not sure. And also, like, I'm wondering who wrote this, right? Like, that's the other thing too, is that how was this list put together?
Well, Terry Poos wrote it.
Terry, hit us up, man.
Terry, come talk to us. This is
But yeah,
alarming.
here's the thing: whoever did write this is not literate in the world of classical music, and that was kind of my big takeaway from this, is that I think that it's even less helpful than it could be, because the person who did this is clearly relying on like Spotify metadata, because like the titles are really bad. So it says, quote, A Midsummer Night's Dream, Opus 61, number 9, Wedding March, unquote, by Felix Mendelssohn, London Symphony Orchestra, and Peter Maag. Like, who's Peter Maag? I don't know. It's probably some random conductor who like recorded the Wedding March for a budget classical label at some point. And this person looked it up and found that. But like, it's not ordered in the way that, a classical musician would look to, you would expect to see it say Mendelssohn, A Midsummer Night's Dream, Wedding March. And that's all we need. Like, you don't need to know who the performer is unless you're linking it somehow. So, just as a general example of classical illiteracy, this really stood out.
Can we just start with the fact that the title of this article is called Best Classical Music Wedding Songs?
Oh, yes. Our favorite bête noire, which we've talked about before.
It's just depressing the way that it masquerades as an authority in music by describing it. There's just something a little bit insidious about that to me, where it's like for Peer Gynt's Suite Number 1 in the Hall of the Mountain King.
Wedding classic there.
What does it say for that one? What's the perceived function? It
says the build-up is maybe a bit intense, but that's what makes it perfect for the Garter toss.
The Garter toss, another huge opportunity for musicalization, I suppose.
Yeah.
Hey, at least they acknowledge this time something that happens in the music. The buildup might be intense. That's actually true.
Yeah, but it's also like, 3 minutes long.
Right.
When was the last time it took 3 minutes to throw a garter? I guess there's the whole rigmarole of like, going up the leg or like whatever. It's just like, do you know how weddings are constructed even? Like, this makes me question, do you even know what weddings do? Much less how to recommend music. Here's another one, Finlandia by Jean Sibelius. Why we love it. Nothing says just got hitched like a melodic piece to welcome the new couple. Now, I just got done conducting this piece. I will admit, the chorale melody is one of the most excellent chorales anywhere. I hard-pressed to think of a chorale that is like more soulful but also dignified. But the beginning of Finlandia does not sound like that. If you put this on your Spotify playlist, you ain't going to end up with what you wanted.
Right. Yeah. Look, here are some other ones. It's just a cavalcade of sadness here. Like, Una furtiva lagrima. You can practically feel the romance coming alive. This magnificent melody would work nicely for a slow dance tune. Una furtiva lagrima means a furtive tear. And then you've got the Gymnopédie number 1 by Eric Satie. This soft, slow tune would be perfect for a first dance or a poignant entrance. Like, what a epic sad boy fail that would be. Like, if you're like the bride and the groom dancing to Gymnopédie number 1, like, wouldn't you feel like just like maybe in like a Wes Anderson film or something where like you knew that a tragedy was about to befall these people?
Yeah, it's more appropriate for last dance, not first dance.
Well, to be fair, I am on the brides.com website right now, and they have an article that was, I guess, updated just even a month before this one. That's like 75 most romantic wedding songs of all time. So this is a little bit more like pop music, not as niche as classical music. And yet all they do is basically list a song, and they write, instead of why we love it, it's lyrics of love, and they just list the lyrics. and then they move on to the next one. There's 75 songs. So clearly, this site is not one that does a lot of research or in-depth explanation of their choices.
Yeah, and far be it from us to actually take it too seriously. Like, I mean, we really did bring it to you listeners for laughs, because these descriptions are to die for. They're so
Egmont!
funny.
Egmont Overture is on here. Keep Wedding's guests on the edge of their seats with a faster-paced Beethoven classic.
That's what you really want. The guests to be thinking, what is going to happen now?
But the whole thing about like this kind of an El Cheapo wedding website, I mean, it does just point out that like there is lots of money to be made exploiting the
wedding industry.
The fears and hopes and dreamscapes of young brides in particular.
Although I do want to pick out one line from here, which is under the number 39 selection, The Arrival of the Queen of Sheba by Georg Friedrich Handel, which incidentally is actually a pretty good selection musically.
Yeah.
But the description is, the royals have great intros, enough said. And then it says, we'd hire an orchestra to play this any day.
Do it.
Yeah.
Do it.
Yeah.
Do it. Hire an orchestra, please.
And then tell us how it went.
And have them play Hall of the Mountain King for your garter toss.
All right, I think we're good here. Everyone, just if you want a quick laugh over this weekend, check out this article. We'll link it in the show notes, and let's move on. Will, what do you have for us?
In August 2020, an interesting paper appeared in the Journal of Research in Music Education titled "Multi-Level Models of the Relationship Between Music Achievement and Reading and Math Achievement." If that title befuddles you, you're not alone. One of the paper's co-authors, Martin Bergee, has even apologized for the study's complexity. Essentially, the paper and the research behind it were inspired by Dr. Bergee's skepticism about the link between music education and academic achievement that has become a sort of folk wisdom among musicians. With that in mind, Bergee and his co-author Kevin Weingarten set out to disprove the link between music and academic achievement by controlling for myriad factors that might have influenced previous studies, such as a student's race and gender, their family's income level and level of educational achievement, or the neighborhood that the family lives in. And what did the researchers find? Quote, "Not only did the connections between music and academic achievement not disappear, but the relationships are really strong." To discuss the findings of this study, we are delighted to have with us today one of the co-authors himself, Dr. Martin Bergee. Dr. Bergee is a professor of music education and music therapy at the University of Kansas and chair of the executive committee of the Music Education Research Council. Prior to these appointments and a previous stint on the faculty of the University of Missouri-Columbia, he taught high school and middle school band in St. Joseph, Missouri. Martin, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be here.
So, Martin, I wanted to start off with something that I read in the article about this study, which is that you had thought that there was a misunderstanding about correlation versus causation when it comes to linking musical studies and academic achievement in reading and math among young students. Could you talk about what you mean by that, and how did you try to disaggregate these?
I think it's been around for a long time now. It has been since I was young that music makes you smarter. If you study music, if you listen to music, if you even walk past a radio with music playing, that somehow you're going to be smarter. That's a cause and effect way of thinking. And I wasn't convinced that there was a relationship that lies behind music achievement and academic achievement that would be the basis for cause and effect. My assumption was that the relationships that are found, and they're going to be found because achievement always relates to achievement, but they're explained by things like where the student lives, how much and to what extent their family has education, the usual things. You mentioned them yourself. So my intention was essentially to show that those correlations are spurious, meaning that they can be explained by other things, such as race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and so forth. And I fully expected that to happen. And then to my surprise and Kevin's, it didn't happen that way, that the relationships remain strong and all those other things explain the relationship. It remained strong in spite of the fact that the other predictors, the other explainers were were quite strong themselves.
Tell us about how you controlled for some of those factors, and then how you ended up drawing the conclusions in a very kind of skeletal sense.
In school, you may have at one time or another experienced regression. We all drew a regression line when we were in the 7th grade, more or less. And it's possible to have regression with more than one so-called independent variable. You can have 2 independent variables that predict something. You can have 3, or you can have 1,000,003. And when you put those variables into a design, any one outcome controls for all the other variables. So if you have 4 variables in the design, then you have a pure relationship between variable A and the so-called dependent variable, controlling for B, C, and D. The reason that that's important is because the relationship between music achievement and academic achievement is by virtue of the fact that this is essentially a stepped up multiple regression. That relationship has had all of those other variables controlled for. And that's why it's a so-called singular or pure relationship. There could be other things that also explain it that I didn't include. That's the problem, because you never know what you should have included but didn't. And one doesn't have access to every single thing that might influence something as complicated as achievement. Every time I answer a question like this, I always kind of experience some remorse. I hope that made at least some sense.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I'm taken right back to my statistics class, which was the last time I engaged with that material was like 15 years ago. But yeah, I mean, it just sounds like a huge task of data wrangling, I think is what you're describing. Is that most of what you were doing, or was there another step where you experimented with, live subjects in any way, or was that the whole process?
Data wrangling is that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I use that term and not cite you? Is that okay? I just had a devil of a time. There were 1,081 students who participated in the study.
Wow.
The data files themselves, and they went 1,081 columns down, and they went over probably 200 columns by the time I did all the various transformations and
Wow.
so forth. Goodness knows how many jillions of numbers that ended up being.
Yeah. Wow.
The answer to your question is no, there were no intermediate steps. I didn't walk up to this. I just did it. And actually, the first time I did the study, which was several years ago, actually, I did it wrong and didn't know that I did it wrong, but I knew that something was wrong. So I just let it sit for a while until I could come back around to it and know it better and understand it better.
Well, speaking of patience, you taught high school and middle school band prior to all of this. Did any part of that play into your skepticism, or were you one that saw some correlation yourself when you were teaching?
When I taught high school and middle school band, my best students were everybody else's good students. They would take their science projects to various places and win big awards. They would write poetry, and their poetry would win awards. They would just go from classroom to classroom, and their teachers thought that they were just the absolute best because they were. Then they would come to my classroom, and I would think the same thing. That's what led me to believe that there's something that lies behind achievement, no matter what the mode is. And the students I had seemed to have a lot of those things in common. They were very good students. They liked to achieve. They came from families that were really supportive. And I guess, come to think of it, that might have been where my skepticism about some sort of a unique relationship, the seeds of doubt began to grow at that time. Which is not to say that music is the same thing as math and reading and science. It's something very different. But whatever it takes to learn math and science and poetry well may be the same things or similar things that are used to learn music well, too.
So, Martin, I would presume that you are of the opinion that arts should be well funded in schools, and that they form a large component of student life and should be available to everybody who wants them. So what takeaways from your study, like if you were advocating for increased arts funding in front of a governmental panel or organization or a school board, something like that, what takeaways from your study would you present, and how would you present them?
There's really one and only one takeaway to this study, at least so far as I'm concerned. Not that you can't drill down into it and find other things too. You can. It was a complex study, but the main point that Kevin and I tried to make, we tried to make in the discussion, which is, this is something I've known for a long time, but I think it's safe to say that a lot of people, most people, almost all the time, see learning as pretty much modular and domain specific. They go to one mode of learning, and then they go to another mode of learning, and then they go to another mode of learning. And that might suggest to people that those modes of learning are separable. If that's the case, you can withdraw one mode of learning and not have it affect any other mode of learning because the modes are modular. And what we attempted to say, although it's a complex argument to make, is that at a foundational level in the mind, these areas are related. And they're related by means of so-called domain general learning processes. And the point I would make to a school board member or someone who's in charge of the budget is, you will not enhance literacy or math by withdrawing a crucial subject area. And you're not going to help children and youths. You aren't going to do it. You're going to hurt them. You're going to make it more difficult to learn, say, math or science or reading, because every component reinforces every other component. And they're all reinforced by a series of domain general learning processes. But you can't learn those processes directly. What you learn is math, music, reading, etc. And then those develop the domain general processes, and those in turn turn around and develop the student's mind in the subject areas. It just depends on what people think schools are for. I think the schools are there for the intellectual, social, and emotional development of children and adolescents. But there are others who, in fact, if you ask 100 people, what are schools for, you may get 100 different answers. You're certainly going to get about 90 different answers. So maybe the first thing we should do is all get together and decide why we have schools. If they're there for learning, then we need to approach the human mind the way it is, instead of the way we might want it to be. The human mind is an interconnected phenomenon. It's not a modular phenomenon. That's not the easiest case to make in just a few words. And if someone is disposed not to hear that argument, then they're not going to hear that argument.
This is an interesting counterpoint. A lot of people are now sort of viewing school in this very utilitarian terms of, we educate kids in order so that they might do their function in our society. And that in many ways necessarily leads us to this kind of narrow, modular, as you call it, kind of mode of education where you educate people with things that they will use in the future, and no more and no less than that. And it's just a striking and very kind of humanistic way, what you've described, of reframing education, or just framing education. I don't even want to call it reframing, because I find it depressing at this point that we've started to view school as this sort of machine for getting people jobs.
Schools have always been viewed that way.
Yeah.
I think the real conflict has come with, so far as I'm concerned, it essentially arose with American high school. They don't teach, for example, to most students, most of the time, they don't teach literacy directly. Mm-hmm. But you'll almost always find a course in, say, Shakespeare. Well, why? Because Shakespeare is excellent subject matter in that particular area. But who cares? What difference does it make if a student reads Shakespeare? That's not going to get the student employed as an engineer or in the local 24-hour food mart or anything in between. If you look at what secondary schools teach, a lot of it is not directly tied to what any particular individual is going to do for a living. So why do we go to all that trouble? High schools are expensive things. let's just go back to an 8th grade education. So if you look at education that way, then why bother? You can teach the fundamentals of what one might need to know in most jobs in a lot less time than 12 years. There must be a reason that we, other than just keep them busy and off the streets, which is also a reason, I get that.
Yeah.
But there must be a reason that we go to so much trouble to do more than just keep them off the street and not herd them into human cattle pens and just leave them there until the end of the day and dismiss them and go home.
Yeah, Martin, a lot of what you're saying, it resonates very strongly with another interview that we did for this podcast. We had a music therapist, a lovely British lady named Grace Meadows, on the show to talk about how music therapy is used in Alzheimer's therapy and working with patients with dementia. And she made a very similar point to the one that you're making about how learning and brain activity is not modular, even as much as we've mapped out the various areas of the brain that are responsible for certain things. And one of the points that she said was music is so useful in her line of work because it crosses all of these boundaries of the brain. And because it fires the various neurons in the different sectors, it reconnects these areas that, because of the disease might have become disconnected. And so a person can go from being lost inside their head to once again reawakening into the present. And, as she pointed out, you can't just wait until somebody is ravaged with dementia to expose them to music. It doesn't work that way. We have to be exposed to music in society from an early age and right up to the end of our lives. And then that can really help with so many functions in so many areas.
Like more than exposed, I think that we certainly need to be exposed, but we're exposed to music all the time. We're completely immersed in a musical culture, and the exposure is every waking and probably every sleeping moment too. We do more, for example, than just expose children to a native language. We also develop them in that language. I would say that we need to go beyond exposure and also teach students things like music. Her point about reconnections, that's exactly the point to make. But a point that I would like to make that's the same point is that those connections have to be established in the first place. Mm-hmm. They don't arise naturally like a wasp's ability to build a nest or something like that. Those connections are not hardwired into the human brain. That's why we have education, because we need to learn things. So first, let's do a good and a better job of establishing those connections in the first place with children and adolescents.
Well, Martin, this is all very interesting, and I really appreciate your skeptical approach. I think that adds legitimacy and fuel to the fire of the argument that you're making. We are very much on the same page with you, and we certainly hope that your work here furthers the causes that you believe so strongly in. So thank you for joining us on the podcast. Before we let you go, Martin, would you be willing to stick around and recommend something for our classical mixtape?
I would.
In our classical mixtape, we each recommend some music that's caught our ear this week to share with our listeners. So, guest of honor, Martin, what do you have for us this week?
I'm a large ensemble person. I've spent my entire life essentially playing in and teaching band and orchestra. I love large choruses. I love large orchestras and what they're able to produce and express. I've been telling myself now I'm 65 years old, so probably at least 50 of those years, that it would be good if I knew more about chamber music. Until recently, for example, I was embarrassed at how little I knew, for example, the string quartet literature, which is, as a body of literature, is one of the greatest achievements in Western civilization. And here I am, just, kind of thinking, well, I'll learn that next year or the year after. Well, thanks to YouTube and the fact that there are dozens of sites now, they've amassed their information from several sources. These are the 20 greatest chamber music pieces of all time. Mm-hmm. And there's a fair amount of overlap in those lists. So I made a list, which was about 50 pieces of music that appeared on more than one of those lists.
A meta-analysis. Look at you, ever the academic researcher.
If you had to pick your favorite discovery along this journey, the piece that you were like, I really like, I can't believe I hadn't heard of this before, which one comes to you first?
Oh, that just pops right into my mind, as a matter of fact. It's Beethoven's 14th String Quartet. You might, at one time or another, have watched the Band of Brothers series. And you may recall that in the ruins of a German town, this string quartet sat down in the middle of a destroyed avenue, and they played the slow movement of that quartet in its entirety on that program. But it's actually a quartet that many of us have experienced before in different contexts, and we just didn't know what it was.
Thanks so much, Martin, and thanks for being with us today. Kensho, what do you have for a mixtape today?
Okay, so I am bringing a piece that I'm going to get to conduct in about 2 weeks. It is Louise Farrenc's Third Symphony, and this is a recent discovery for me. Farrenc's 3 symphonies, I hadn't heard of them before, and I've completely fallen in love with this third one in particular. And so I want to share with our listeners the first movement of the symphony, and this particular performance is by our favorite, or one of our favorite orchestras, the Aurora Orchestra, with Duncan Ward conducting. Got all the lovely things of the Sturmendrang. It's awesome.
Yeah, it's kind of a dark Mozart vibe.
Oh, it's so reminiscent of the little G minor, right?
And even a little bit the big G minor.
And it's also very Mendelssohnian in a way.
For sure.
Yeah.
Be great at a wedding.
Okay, Will your selection be good for a wedding?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, considering that literally anything is appropriate for a wedding according to brides.com. My selection this week is a piece by Luigi Boccherini. It is his 7th cello concerto. Now, why in the world would I recommend this? Well, this is yet another case when I would strongly recommend that our listeners check out the video of the performance that I'm recommending. This is an orchestra that I've talked about many times in the past, the HR Sinfonieorchester, which is the Frankfurt Radio Symphony Orchestra, conducted this time by Andrea Marcon. And here's the cool thing about this video, is that the performance is not on a regular cello. It's on an instrument called the violoncello da spalla, which is basically like a small cello that is played in the manner of it's played upright, like a violin or a viola would be, but you can't quite fit this whole thing under your chin. It's unlike anything you're likely to see. The instrument itself has 5 strings instead of 4, and it's just very cool. I mean, it's a great piece of music too, but and the guy who's playing it has like a puffy shirt, like a pirate shirt type thing. You know, he's into the vibe of his whole historical.
Is this Sergei Malov that's playing?
Yeah, this is Sergei Malov. Are you familiar with him?
Yeah. I mean, he's a big time violinist, or used to be at least, who did really well in a lot of international competitions. Is super good, and then started to do more of this kind of violoncello da spalla stuff.
Awesome recommendation, Will. Thanks so much. So, piggybacking off my own segment from earlier, the Stanford Irish Rhapsody No. 1, I thought I would recommend another one. So here I'm recommending Irish Rhapsody No. 6, Opus 191. This was Stanford's final piece. And in fact, even though it is an orchestral work, it's actually a violin concerto more like. This is a recording by Lydia Mordkovich, along with Vernon Handley and the Ulster Orchestra. You'll find the links to all these and to our full classical mixtape playlist in the show notes.
And with that, it's time to wrap up this episode of the Classical Gabfest. I'm Kensho Watanabe, and on behalf of Tiffany Liu and William White, I'd like to thank you so much for listening and to encourage you to subscribe and rate us on Apple Podcasts. We'd also love your help spreading the word about the show on social media, where you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can reach us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com, and we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, happy listening, and we'll be with you next week.